Good morning, everyone. On this side of the Atlantic, at least. Good afternoon to everyone on the other side. Excellencies, members of the diplomatic corps, government representatives of our allied nations, senators, members of parliament, generals, general and flag officers, and members of the Canadian Armed Forces, colleagues from Global Affairs Canada, Public Safety Canada, CSIS, the RCMP, as well as our many other guests from government, business, and academia. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today in this first joint event we are co-hosting with the EU Delegation to Canada. Merci à tous d'être parmi nous aujourd'hui. Je m'appelle Yuri Cormier, je suis directeur exécutif de la Conférence des associations de la défense. Au nom de notre président, le lieutenant général Guy Thibault, notre conseil d'administration et nos commanditaires, je vous souhaite tous la bienvenue à ce 4e webinaire de la série Experts Métro, Access Denied, the Art of Fighting Back Foreign Electoral Interference. Before we begin, let me take a moment to introduce the Conference of Defense Associations. We're based in Ottawa and have been around since 1932. We're an umbrella organization for 40 member associations who represent over 400,000 active and retired members of the Canadian Armed Forces. Our flagship annual Ottawa Conference on Security and Defense is the largest of its kind in Canada and will be celebrating its 89th anniversary next March 10 and 11. I hope you'll join us then, whether it's in person or online. Our institute is a registered charity organization which conducts research and analysis and educational programs. Above all else, we're a forum where a community of people who care about Canada's role in the world come together to engage in open dialogue. We foster and promote a facts-based and rational approach to defense and security policy in the country. And so let me move on to the question of today's webinar, which is why we're here. The program runs for about an hour and 20 minutes, the last 15 minutes of which will be dedicated to a live Q&A with everyone who's in the audience. So the question is, how do you participate in this Q&A? It's rather simple. You just type in your question into the text box to the right of your screen and send them in. Behind the scenes, my team and I will sift through them as they come in, and we'll choose our favorite ones, which will then be sent to the moderator and to our panelists to take on. If you're experiencing any kind of technical difficulty, if you get dropped off during the event, feel free to send an email to my colleague Jane. She'll be assisting people in real time. And it's a really easy email to remember, jane@cdainstitute.ca. So don't hesitate to get in touch with her. The final thing I want to do before handing it over to our moderator is to thank Metro Supply Chain Group, our webinar series sponsors, as well as the Amazon Web Services, AWS, for sponsoring today's event, and our organizational sponsors, RBC Insurance, ADIA Consulting Group, IBM, KPMG, L3 Harris, Lockheed Martin, Logistic Unicorp, and Raytheon. Most importantly, though, I'd like to thank the EU Delegation to Canada, which contributed to the funding of this event and played a key role in brainstorming the themes with us, engaging speakers, and reaching out to new audiences and introducing them to the work that the CDA Institute does. This has been a spectacular partnership, and it was a real pleasure to work with all of you. And finally, let me introduce our moderator, Mr. Richard Fadden, an officer of the Order of Canada, former director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, Deputy Minister of Defense, and National Security Advisor to Prime Ministers Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau. And luckily for me and my team, he's also a member of the Conference of Defense Associations Institute Board. Thank you, Dick, for your thought leadership in matters of security and defense and for agreeing to join us today on the webinar. I'm going to pass the mic off now to Eva Palatova, who's the head of the political section at the EU Delegation to Canada, and she'll offer some opening remarks. So Eva, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yuri. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour, tout le monde. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar on behalf of the EU Delegation to Canada. The topic of today's webinar could not be more pertinent. Both the European and North American continent have painfully experienced attempts of foreign interference into our democratic institutions, elections, referenda, but also parliament and government offices. And just last week, the Council of the European Union sanctioned 2 persons and 1 entity for involvement in cyber attacks against the German Bundestag. In July this year, the same body, Council of the European Union, listed for the first time a number of persons and entities for their involvement in several cyber attacks, among themselves the WannaCry, NotPetya, and also the Operation Cloudhopper cyber espionage campaign. and also the attempted unauthorized access to the network of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons Organization. With these decisions, we make it clear to everyone that we continue to be determined to take action to deter perpetrators of cyber attacks and hold them accountable. But of course, the crucial response does not come only through deterrence and punishment, but also through prevention, threat mitigation, and proactive countering of interference. As today's webinar will show, the EU is cooperating closely with counterparts in Canada and the US to prevent and counter cyber attacks, tackle the threat of disinformation, and limit foreign interference aimed at undermining our democracies. And with the excellent speakers lined up here, today is an opportunity to explore where and how we go deeper in technology, in defense capabilities, the regulatory field, and in policymaking. I'm glad that with the CDAI, we have an excellent partner to provide a virtual platform for discussions about security and defense and to bring together the best experts from across the Atlantic. As the European Union delegation in Ottawa, we are working on a series of webinars looking into other areas critical for transatlantic security and highlighting opportunities for cooperation between the European Union and Canada. In spite of the limitations imposed on all of us by COVID, these webinars promise many more interesting discussions. Thank you, Yuri, thank you everyone, thank you for this excellent opportunity, and I wish us all a fruitful conversation today. And now, Richard, over to you.
Thank you very much. To cover the geographic dispersal of everyone on this webinar, good day. I'll use an expression that our Australian friends tend to use. And again, welcome to CDAI's latest webinar, in this case, one dealing with foreign interference in elections. As Yuri said, I'm Dick Fadden, and I hope to usefully moderate today's discussions. I will not go through the pedigree of all of our distinguished panel, because I hope you've had a chance to look at their CVs, their bio notes. But let me just remind you that they are Heli Tiermar-Klar, currently Estonia's ambassador for cyber diplomacy, Sean Rush, formerly from the United States, formerly with the CIA, and Johan Schmidt from the European Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats. So let me give you a bit of a sense of how we hope the day or the hours will go. First, I'll take a couple of minutes to give you some context that I hope will be helpful. Each panelist will then be given 5 to 7 minutes to work through their presentation. We'll then have a moderated discussion for something along the lines of 20, 25 minutes. We will open up then the floor for questions, 15 to 20 minutes, and say goodbye with closing remarks, 3 or 4 minutes. Again, as Yuri said initially, our goal is somewhere near an hour and a half. So let me start things off with an attempt to put this topic, this issue, in a bit of a context. And I think this is very important because we will not, I think at any rate, successfully deal with this issue with election interference unless we develop policies, technologies, and et cetera, that take into account the environment in which they are taking place. The first step, I think, is to settle on who is interfering. Clearly, PRC in Russia, but also potentially a few other governments. I think we need now to worry a little bit about criminal groups, international criminal groups, and also in some countries, extremists, domestic extremists, both of left and the right wing. They add a complexity to this issue, which I think we should not entirely ignore. Clearly, Russia and China are the main players, and we need to work our way through what they are doing. But I think it's critically important to remember as we try and deal with election interference that this is only one tool in their cyber toolkit. And there are a variety of other things that they're doing in the cyber world that we can't ignore. And I think the other thing that we need to remember is that in taking into account the geopolitical situation on the planet, cyber itself is only one of the tools in their toolkit for sowing confusion and chaos throughout the world. To deal successfully with, I think, cyber interference in elections, we have to remember cyber is much broader, and the adversarial relationship that we have with these in other countries is much broader than cyber. So my point is that nothing really operates in a closed system, and that our countering cyber elections can positively or negatively impact these other relationships that I've mentioned, and that we need to take this into account. My second point is that we should try and avoid our usual Western ethnocentrism and not assume it's only advanced Western countries whose elections are affected. In fact, I think it's probably true that countries with less experience with elections are probably more easily targeted and are being targeted, to the point that in those cases, national level outcomes are possible. My third point is that we need to remember that interference can take place at other points than at the national level. By and large, we've focused in Canada, and I think elsewhere as well, on national level. But we have subnational groups, we have municipalities, we have counties, and in many cases, it's much easier to affect the outcomes beneath the national level. And in some instances, that can have a very significant effect on national life. And my final point is also cautionary. However brilliant our panelists are and however great the solutions that they come up with, the environment that they talk about, we need to remember that cyber generally and election interference, both positively and negatively in the sense of countering, is an ongoing evergreen effort on the part of both the instigators and the defenders. There is no silver bullet. And as soon as we find some ways of dealing with interference, our adversaries will come up with others. So it's particularly important that we accept, I think, that the challenges that are being presented by election interference are not going to go away if we come up with a particular solution at a particular point in time. So before I turn to my colleagues, keep in mind, I suggest, that the following questions. Who are the targets? Who are the instigators? What are their methods? And what are their ultimate objectives? We need to answer these questions, whether we do so today or more broadly when we think about these things in the weeks and the months ahead, I think, if we're going to be successful in dealing with the issue of election interference. So having said that, and hopefully given a little bit of a context to what we're talking about, let me turn to our first speaker, Sean Rush from the United States. Sean, over to you.
Well, good morning from California. And I just want to start by saying the most important thing, which is thank you out there to everyone who's in service. Thank you to everyone who's supporting as a contractor vendor. And thank you for those who are engaging in the scholarship and study of these issues, because just as Dick said, this is something ongoing, a constant learning process. Cyber is an area that really challenges acumen, first and foremost, with a terminology that keeps changing, that few understand. So let's break the problem into two big pieces. The first is the issue of influence, malign influence. And in the United States, it is playing to the discourse that is happening in our country and manipulating that. And the other side of the problem is actually probing of election systems, getting into systems and what is typically referred to as a cyber attack or cyber intrusion. On both sides, one thing that's very important that we constantly have to develop tools for is an assessment of what's the impact. To date, on the 2016 elections in the United States, there is still robust debate that if Cambridge Analytica or any of these other efforts, or the malign efforts or the bots, what really influenced? Was there an influence? Were these things successful? Now, the mere fact they're happening is unacceptable. On the probing side, we have seen and continue to see, and as recently as last week, we saw reports of foreign entities, to include the Iranians, getting into US election systems. Now, did we see them interfering, doing something to the voter rolls, messing with the machines? That's what people jump to and the reporting jump to. But again, that impact assessment has got to be key, and it's got to happen at the speed of mission, not the speed of investigation. In 2016, our country experienced, and I was at the CIA at the time, a vapor lock when the issue of election interference, when we really saw how big it was. There were roles and missions discussions. There was debate over what does a DoD do in a domestic situation. And in large part, we turned to our partners and allies who had been experiencing this for years across many countries in Europe and Eastern Europe, and said, how are you dealing with this? And by 2018, we had changed our methods, and by 2020, we continue to change it. And when we say change our methods, when we look at dealing with an issue like this, the principles of deterrence do not work. Deterrence is first and foremost defense. Our defense wasn't where it needs to be. And you're never done with defense in the cyber world. Most of our election systems were not in the cloud. The cloud on its weakest day is more secure than anything on a client server system. Our love of legacy in the United States, our nostalgia for legacy, is a weakness when it comes to cyber. Next, attribution. Now, It just takes too long, and it is not part of solving the problem at speed. Next is response. When we found out Russians were interfering in our election and people said we should interfere in their election, well, got to tell you, only one person's running. There's really not a lot to interfere with. The outcome's already known. And the last part of deterrence is resilience. Now, we have become more resilient, but that resilience is what Dick is talking about. That is something we always have to do. And the day we think our systems are hardened enough or resilient enough, we just committed the worst error of cyber and the worst error of the digital world, which is complacency. And finally, I want to say in 2020, there's been some tremendous leadership that has stepped forward, and leadership is such an important part of this issue. And leadership happening principally by the head of our US Cyber Command, who is operating on unclassified networks with his other parts of government, using the public cloud in a secure way to talk to partners all over the world, and then deploying people to places like Montenegro to work with partners to understand what they're seeing and how it can help us. So that's a brief introduction.
Thanks very much, Sean. We'll come back to some of the things that you said during our moderated section. Can I move to our second panelist, Johan Schmidt from the European Center for Excellence. Johan, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, Excellencies, Generals, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks a lot to the organizers, to the CDA Institute, and to the EU delegation to Canada for this kind invitation, for having me here, and for the possibility to share a few thoughts with you, and hereby bringing in the hybrid threats, the hybrid conflict, and the hybrid warfare perspective, because this is closely linked to the topic of today. My name is Johan Schmidt. I'm the director for the Community of Interest on Strategy Defense at the European Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats, which is located in Helsinki, Finland. In short, it is the Hybrid Center of Excellence. As the focus of today's event is about the question, what is the threat employed by disruptive actors against us? What is the situation in also particularly in Europe? What are the countermeasures and what are possibilities for active defense, but also for cooperation and coordination? Let me start with highlighting that the establishment actually of our center and the portfolio our center is dealing with is a living example exactly for this. At the same time, it is a living example for the strong transatlantic link between the European Union and NATO and the respective participating states or NATO allies. So let me just go a bit back. We are still a startup endeavor, a relatively new small center, and the wake-up call for us for the establishment of our center was the war in, or was hybrid warfare in and regarding Ukraine, which had many dimensions, and the military domain just being one element of that. But elections also being an important issue here, not so much regarding election interference on our side, but even establishing a new kind of election or referendum processes. So it was particularly the kind and the way how Russia and respective non-state actors had been challenging us and Ukraine on this field. It was particularly the creative use and the creative combination of soft, hard, as well as smart power tools, combining them in a creative way to reach political goals, including the use of force and the use of military force, and using particularly also military threat or the threat component on this field to strengthen and to further enable subversive and disintegrating actors on the ground. And by this kind of by operating in the shadow of various interfaces, particularly between the interface between war and peace, and friend and foe, or between internal and external security, or the military and the civil domain, or between, when it comes to cyber, between the cyber and the virtual domain, and the physical and the real world on the other side, or between reality and truth on the one side and fiction and propaganda on the other. So by doing so, traditional lines of order and responsibilities are blurred. Ambiguity is created, which makes attribution difficult, and to a certain degree then paralyzes the decision-making process of the opponent, of the victim, but also of the international community to respond properly and in time. So what we realized, or what the European Union and the participating states, member states, realized that time was a kind of lack of situational awareness, and that this needs to be improved. And so the idea for the establishment of our center, which main task is to work on, let's say, improving awareness, improving understanding of this kind of hybrid challenges on different escalation spectrums or levels of escalation. So this goes back to the first document which was created by the European Union on countering hybrid threats, which is the joint framework on countering hybrid threats of the European Union from 2016. And this document included 22 action points structured in 4 fields, starting with improving awareness, building resilience on a very broad field, critical infrastructure, cybersecurity, but also energy-related issues. The third point, focusing on crisis response, and the third point, and the fourth one, improving cooperation, particularly between the European Union and NATO. And action point 4, which is related to improving awareness, is the establishment of our center, and Finland took the initiative to bring that forward. The center is now active since 3 years, founded in 2017. We have meanwhile 29 participating states on board. Still, the interest is still high. EU and NATO are on board from the very beginning, not as participants, but as, let's say, supportive elements, and taking part at our steering board meetings, supporting us, and also we are working towards the both organizations. And in this sense, it is a unique construction. It's not a NATO Center of Excellence, but it goes back to this initiative by the European Union. And as we said from the very beginning, that countering hybrid challenges, and the spectrum is very broad, it includes multiple domains and dimensions, and all, let's say, possibilities of escalation upwards, but also downwards, including all the possibilities for subversive disintegrating elements. For this reason, the center is following a kind of network-based approach, staying small and flexible, well knowing that not all of the expertise will be able to be accumulated at the center. So we are building our networks, reaching out to the participating states and bringing their expertise on board. In contrast, for example, to other entities within the European Union, we are not working based on intel information, but on open source and also on academic-based expertise. The rough structure, and this is covering then the topics we are focusing on, is structured in 3 so-called communities of interest. One on hybrid influencing, one on focusing on vulnerabilities and resilience in a very broad spectrum of this understanding, and the third one on strategy and defense, which is particularly my field of responsibility, and 2 elements which are enabling these 3 COIs. This is an additional research element and a element which is focusing on exercises and training. So this is about the rough structure. As mentioned, a unique construction as it brings together the transatlantic component and linking the European Union and NATO from the very idea of its establishment. So thank you very much. This should be sufficient for a short introduction.
Johan, thank you very much. We'll come back to a number of the points that you've made. Our last panelist is Ambassador Thierry. Over to you.
Hello, everybody. and welcome from very warm Tallinn, which is unusually warm during this time of the year. So I'm asked by the chair to talk about the cooperation between the Western nations and mobilization of our collective activities against interference activities that we have experienced. So I am going to talk about some of the elements that we have done in the European Union, and then also more globally what we do with the like-minded coalition of the nations in order to respond to the cyber operation. On election interference, a few years ago already, Estonia, together with some of the other member states, has put together the compendium of the best practices on cybersecurity of elections. The origin of this compendium was the understanding that not all European Union member states are using the same technical equipment to support the elections. And of course, Estonian elections, as you might have heard, are also carried out online. So around 1/4 of Estonians is using online solution for elections, and we haven't experienced any of the interference here because we have the very secure digital authentication system nationally. But there are other elements in many parts of the European Union where member states have been paying attention to the different pieces of equipment and different cyber vulnerabilities related to the elections. For instance, even putting together the voters' database or interfering to the database of the voters, meaning that somebody is hacking to the computer and interfering to the database is possible in some parts. So I think there are many parts of the value chain, if we call the election value chain like this, where cybersecurity has to be taken seriously. So we can do quite many efforts on our end by denying the access and by the denial of interference. So this deterrence by denial is something what I think many of the smaller nations in the European Union have chosen in order to protect their either critical infrastructure or the election infrastructure. So, but of course, sometimes the deterrence by denial doesn't work and you have to do a bit more. And here we have the best practices of doing the collective activities amongst the like-minded nations. There is a broader like-minded group where many European countries, Canada, US, Australia, and some others belong, with whom we have started coordinated attribution actions. So we have done a few coordinated attributions since 2018, and we continue to do those coordinated attributions. We also have different elements of response, and the European Union has put together something that we call cyber diplomacy toolbox, which is prescribing what kind of collective action is available for the European Union member states in order to make sure that we show our collective resolve to respond to several cyber operations. So, and very importantly, we have been able to implement the sanctions against the entities that carried out malicious cyber activities. So the first sanction package by the European Union member states was put together this July, or was adopted this July, and the second one was adopted last week. So we have seen already that the European Union is able to respond to cyber operations, and there is collective will and also the mechanism available for us how we can respond to these malicious cyber activities. And of course, we continue to do so. So thank you.
Thanks very much. So what I would like to do now, if you all agree, is just raise a couple of issues, ask a couple of questions to our panelists. and we will see whether their perspectives is the same or whether they attack these issues somewhat differently. So I'd like to ask my first question to all of you. Sean mentioned in his introductory remarks that one of the challenges in dealing with this issue was complacency. And I would divide complacency into two parts. There's complacency on the part of various governmental authorities, political actors and others on the one hand, and on the other, complacency on the part of our populations. So can I ask you each to comment a little bit from your perspective on how important is it for when we are dealing with foreign interference in elections to deal with the issue of complacency? Or can we simply carry on within our cyber defensive world and not worry too much about it? So Sean, since you raised it first, would you mind commenting on the issue of complacency from the perspective of the US, and then we'll follow the same order?
I think certainly, Dick, one of the big moments for us was when we found ourselves in hearings down at the US Senate, and Senator John McCain, who's now passed on, who's a decorated war veteran, when Department of Defense said, you know, we really don't get involved in this election thing. And Cyber Command said that, and actually was a good friend of mine, colleague. And Senator McCain looked at all of us and said, what do you, gentlemen and ladies, what do you think your job is? Your job is to defend our country. Your job is to defend and protect our allies and partners. And that means getting out there. And I love the comment of denying through a very active defense. The complacency we found was, first we said, okay, 2016 after that disaster, just give me a mapping of the digital workflow for an election. Show me the digital workflow and then tell me how the data is curated for an election. We couldn't find anybody who had done that. And then we got into it and found, well, yeah, the data's at rest, but it's not encrypted. Yeah, we put in for a budget, we didn't get it. We were spending all of this money on defense for weapon systems, all of this money on intel for strategic and tactical intel, all of this to protect a democracy that's based on being able to elect a government. And the complacency we found was legacy systems that were still running on old client server models that couldn't be patched, couldn't be kept secure. Failure to accept and move to cloud environments, and then failure to evoke the security protections in those cloud environments. And so 2016 was such a shock event. And now COVID's been a next shock event. It's actually driving the elements we wanted. It's eliminating complacency and driving the elements to be much faster. The roles and missions discussion disappeared. The tasking of what intelligence really needed to do, which is in advance, go out and find out the intentions of groups that want to do this, their plans and intentions before they harness them. And as they start to harness them, distribute the information in real time, not in top secret reports that nobody can see and has to go to a vault to read. So it was a big shock event. I still think when it comes to things digital, that it is such an overwhelming topic for people. With the acumen is so challenging at times. The complacency is the constant fight we have to go after.
Thank you, Ambassador. How important is the issue of complacency in your work? Both, and if I can ask you also to comment a little bit on the distribution of responsibility and worry as between the Union and member states. You won't be surprised to hear me say that many people who are outside the Union often find it difficult to figure out exactly whether it is a central Union responsibility or an issue for member states. But first, complacency, and then can you say a few words about the division of responsibilities?
Yes, complacency issue, I think, is very different in different parts of Europe. In our part of Europe, we are very digitalized and we are working very hard every day in order to make sure that our cyber defenses are up to date. Because all our digital society depends on this domain. And in Estonia, I think we don't see complacency, but I can't speak for other member states. And for your other part of the question, what the Union is doing and what the member states are doing. The European Union is operating on a principle of subsidiarity, which means that only those functions will be forwarded to the union level where the national effort is not enough. Election security and organizing elections is very national effort. This is only national effort. The elections of the European Parliament are also actually national effort because all the nations are doing these elections. So we have the national parliaments and the national elections, which is the national responsibility, and also the elections for the European Parliament is national responsibility when we talk about how we organize ourselves. So basically, the compendium of the best practices throughout the European Union, what I talked before about, is a book consisting of best practices from different member states, how we could advise different member states to pay attention to the most typical risks what all different nations, 28 of them, will face when organizing elections. So, but I think it is confusing for those experts who are not part of the European Union or are not studying how the European Union works. But the European Union is not a federal system, and majority of those tasks, what are related to the elections, what are related to national security, what are related to foreign policy, are on national level. So, and this is a complicating issue maybe when we talk about election security in Europe. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Johan, can we have your thoughts on complacency? Is this a relevant consideration for the kind of work that you're doing, that you and your colleagues are doing?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I think it's a highly important question, and even if we are not so much using this term, but the answer from our side is raising awareness and raising understanding. So this is a really important, very important point. And as it was mentioned by Haley, the level of awareness and the level of understanding within our 29 participating states regarding hybrid threats as a whole, which includes election interference, is very, very different. So, and that starts with, let's say, the geostrategic positioning of a certain participating states. So we have a number of participants, of course, who are looking primarily eastwards when it comes to hybrid interference, hybrid challenges, hybrid threats. Others are more looking to the south or to the southeast. And other countries face the main hybrid challenges from within, which is even more challenging and difficult situation. But it is the level of understanding and awareness is very, very different. And that's also the reason why our work in this direction is so important. But let me just highlight how important also the European Union is to inspire and to motivate, let's say, respective participating states to jump on these topics and to increase the level of their awareness. And this counts also for the bigger countries who would just see that, well, there is an initiative ongoing within the European Union. Let's say the joint framework, which I mentioned before. And this includes 22 action points. And many of these action points request active, let's say, activities from the participating states. So it is not so easy to ignore all of this if such active, let's say, inspiring elements are coming from the European Union. And for this reason, the work here, I think, is very important. And the European Union has, I think, inspired many of our participating states to improve or to even jump on the topic of hybrid threats, hybrid challenges, hybrid warfare. And let me just add one additional point, because hybrid actors are not always open, not primarily acting openly. So often, or big portions are let's say, brought forward, covered, or below the threshold, not only below the threshold of the use of force, but even below the threshold of recognition in a, let's say, in a slow motion approach, in a salami tactics approach, using, for example, new technologies, the cyber domain, to infiltrate, for example, critical infrastructure, which may then be exploited for interference operations. So just a very few years ago, the establishment of the 5G network in the European Union or in respective countries was not connected with any kind of security challenges. This is changing, I think, at least a little bit at the moment. And in the whole context, we have to consider that hybrid adversaries are extending the battlefield in a horizontal way. That means including multiple domains and dimensions, not only the political or the diplomatical or the military one, but also, let's say, making the society, including the society, into their battlefield approaches by making use of multiple vector approaches, and also the vertical escalation up to the military, even the threat with the nuclear domain, but also the subversive activities which are trying to let's say go under or pass by a respective functional defensive or deterrence posture. So I think the work the European Union is doing here is highly important and has inspired the thinking and the developments in many of our participating states.
Thank you, Johan. I have another question that is somewhat related to complacency. I think it's fair to say that in Canada, at least, there is some measure of complacency about these threats. It's less than it used to be. And very often when one discusses this issue of foreign interference, the answer is, where's the meat? You know, who's doing this? And, you know, you can't just take it at face value that, you know, we have all these problems if governments aren't prepared to sort of say it's X, Y, or Z. So let me ask you each, how important is attribution? Attribution for acts of foreign interference. Are we doing enough in that area? And if we do start attributing in a systematic way, in a coordinated way, will this cause us more difficulties on the geopolitical front? But Canada, for example, has a tendency of not attributing. We've done so on a few occasions. The United States does so a little bit more. And I think the Union doesn't do it a great deal. But let me ask you all, and Ambassador, if I can start with you, how important is it generally for the work in dealing with countering foreign interference for governments to say country X or country Y did this?
Well, I think it is very important actually to have the fact-based evidence when we want to respond to something what we do not tolerate, right? So when we are facing with the physical conflicts, for instance, when we see that the hospitals in Syria are bombed, so we are trying to figure out or establish who is behind. So I think it's not, of course, so drastic, but it's very important still that even that also in case of below the threshold national security threats, we also are using the same logic. So we try to establish who was behind. So, and attribution is a contested topic in our field. But I think without attribution, it is very difficult to have any effective response strategy. So we have to be able to attribute. We have to be able to understand where the malicious activity came from, and everything what we need to do. And I think what we have been doing in terms of attribution has been a great improvement actually so far, because some of you might remember that when Estonia was attacked in 2007, we were not having any international mechanisms either for attribution or for collective response or any even the discussion forum for cyber attacks or cyber operations. So I think we have actually come a long way now with all these steps, and attribution for us at least will have a central place in devising our response. We cannot have response without attribution.
Thank you. Sean, you come from a country that tends to attribute a little bit more than the rest of us. I think it's probably fair to say that success in doing this has been uneven. I mean, what would your reaction be to the issue of attribution? Should we also cooperate more in sharing information on attribution and collectively start pushing back against those whom we identify as being instigators? And please, Sean, please feel free to leave your video on during this session.
So we've done some what we call name and shame here, down to individuals and organizations. And then the Department of Justice will put out what looks like pretty much mugshots on the attribution. Where I think we need to do a lot more is do it cooperatively, do it jointly, do it with as many of our partners and allies as possible. And also, most importantly, when we're doing the attribution, to speed the process of getting an attribution statement and then put more real meat in it, put the details in there. So the fact is, any classified aspect of how we got to attribution is over the minute we attribute. The half-life of that secret is very, very, very short. It doesn't need to be protected. It doesn't need to be watered down. We need to have robust sharing with our partners. It has to move at speed. So on the attribution, it's been fits and starts, I think, but it has to get to a battle rhythm. And there have been some instances where we've gotten, as a collective, dozens of countries in to agree to name an activity and to sanction, and that's been very effective, and had a stunning result. We know that because we've then collected intelligence on what the result is. So it's got to be a collective effort. It's a team sport, and we really need to have everybody on the field.
Thanks, Sean. Johan, what's your perspective on the issue of attribution?
Yeah, thanks for this question. Well, my first point would be to say there is not the question whether this is important or not, because it is extremely important. But it is, of course, in a hybrid conflict environment, it is difficult. And it's difficult because the hybrid opponent is doing everything, let's say, to create ambiguity and to avoid at least clear attribution. And sometimes for a hybrid, let's say, aggressor, it is already a success when he can, let's say, create a kind of plausible deniability, even if it is clear who it is. And then this depends also on what kind of audience is addressed. Is it the internal or the external audience? So as long as a hybrid actor is able to put some kind of fog around his activities, it's already a part of the success, because it's at least delaying or hampering the decision-making process of the opponent, of the victim, but also of the international arena and or alliances. So this is delaying the reaction. And so I think the point is, it is extremely important, because it would put away the cover which hybrid adversaries are using for various reasons, by the way. But it's difficult to do. And the success for a hybrid opponent is already given if he's just able to let's say, create such kind of, let's say, different kind of realities to keep the gray zone somehow in life. And for this reason, it's important to have a look on the question how hybrid adversaries are creating this ambiguities, because this would help us to better discover it. And what I mentioned before as one of the three key characteristics of hybrid action is that hybrid adversaries tend to operate at various interfaces. And by doing so, they are blurring traditional lines of order and responsibilities. And if an actor is acting in between, let's say, the fields of responsibilities of internal and external security, that's already creating a kind of ambiguity and makes a clear answer very difficult. And my last point here is also related to the dialectic relationship between offense and defense. And unfortunately, we can see at the moment that technology, and cyber might be one of the most prominent fields here, technology is favoring the offensive at the moment. That may not last forever, but at the moment, new technologies, and particularly the cyber domain, is favoring offensive and therefore also potential aggression. Because particularly on the cyber domain, attribution is particularly difficult, non-attribution easy, and creating ambiguity very easy. But it counts also for other technological fields when thinking, for example, about the use of multiple sensors or the use of drones and so on. So unfortunately, and I think that will be an increasing challenge for the upcoming years, we see that that new technologies are favoring the offensive, even the offensive capabilities of smaller state or even non-state actors or individual groups, terrorists or criminal gangs. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Johan. You've actually made it easy for me to ask my next question, which may be slightly easier for Sean and I to deal with since we're not in the employ of our governments. But I'd ask all of you in the context of dealing with what Johan has just said, you know, offensive is easier. Should the West, should our countries, should other countries in NATO and whatnot, take the initiative and take the war back to the instigators of some of these activities that we now find offensive? I mentioned in my introductory remarks that we worry most about, you know, the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation, but there are 3 or 4 other states that become involved in this sort of thing quite regularly. Some focus more on their diasporas than others. But if we're going to be effective in this area, are we going to have to say, you know, this is all very wonderful, we'll build up as many defenses as we can, but we're going to have to take the battle to the instigators? I acknowledge that there are legal, ethical, and whatnot considerations that are raised in our respective societies, but is it possible to deter effectively without some measure of our governments taking the offensive? Sean, do you want to try this one?
Sure. I think it's very important not to default to the response for a cyber intrusion or the cyber attack has to be a cyber response back. That shouldn't be the default. That said, we do know, and the point's been made, there are these actors have personalities and behaviors. They have methodologies of the way they go about doing it. They use different tools, et cetera. But so they also have proxies that are willing and proxies that are unwilling. And that is their infrastructure. And denying their infrastructure is something that should be actively considered. And in some cases, those proxies, that infrastructure, do not know they are being used. They are an unwilling participant, and knocking on their door and revealing what's known, which there's this hesitancy to do this, but revealing your university here, your university servers are being used to launch these attacks against a partner ally nation or against our nation. You need to shut them down or we'll help you mitigate this. And then the proxies that are active proxies for these actors, of which there are 5 principal nation state actors, those are legitimate infrastructure targets to be denied. What I am not talking about though, and a conversation I do not believe should be hosted, are these rather, I'll say, over the top responses of what could be done in cyber, which offensively can be passing and greatly exceeding what I'll say is accepted norms. And we can't get into a role where we are violating norms, because then we are not the democracies that we are trying to defend, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Sean. Ambassador, what's Estonia's position on this sort of thing? Do you gird yourself periodically to take the battle outside of the defensive realm?
Well, I am going to give you a very diplomatic answer, right? So, because this is what I'm paid for. Well, I think most of our nations, as Sean said, are responding within the confines of the existing international law. And existing international law allows few options for the victim states to respond also with certain countermeasures when provided that those countermeasures will be staying on the level of the same activity and are not going to escalate the situation and will be proportionate. But as Sean said, I think also the effective response might not take place in cyber domain itself, but it can be at, for instance, sanctions. And I think the proxy actors specifically, or the third parties that are related to certain operations, might be deterred by the sanctions. If we are able to use the sanctions more often, in European Union terms, it means that certain individuals will be put on the EU non-entry lists. There will be asset freeze in EU entities, and the EU entities will be banned from doing business with those entities outside European Union. I think these are already important deterrent effects for certain proxy actors. So I think there are also some other ways how we can make sure that deterrence works, and I don't always believe that we should have one strategy. I think that strategy always should be a mixed strategy, because we also now see the very different strategies across our Western nations. And cyber people are talking about something that maybe you haven't heard, which is attack surface. So depending on your attack surface, you also devise your strategy differently, because when you are talking about a small country, which actually knows all the important nodes, maybe what should be defended, and because of the size of the country, there is a possibility to defend all those most critical assets. Well, in larger nation with millions of those critical assets, it's not so easy to actually only have the resilience strategy. So I think also the strategy between defensive, offensive depends on what kind of attack surface do you have, and how easy or complex it is to defend the most critical assets in your country.
Thank you. Before I turn to Johan, I'd just like to comment that your point and Sean's point on the use, for example, of sanctions, very valid point. But sanctions, unless they are, I think, imposed by a relatively large number of like-minded countries, tend to be not terribly effective. Even the United States, which is the elephant, the largest player in this area on the Western side, if it imposes sanctions, and nobody else in the West does the same, it significantly diminishes their impact. I just make this relatively obvious point, because sometimes, even in Canada, people say, well, we'll impose sanctions. I would venture to suggest that Beijing does not worry as much as we might think about Canada imposing sanctions. But if all of the EU, Australia, NATO, the United States do so, far, far more effective.
I think
Johan,
you actually hit the point here that we have to do it collectively, and much more collectively, and much more often collectively. Yeah.
Johan, you're a military man. What do you think of these things?
Well, I would start with with highlighting what Sean already mentioned, that as hybrid actors are often exploiting the gray zone between legal and illegal activities or fields. Of course, we have to stay on the legal side, so that's not an option for us to switch the sides here. So that would be my starting point. But when it comes to the question how active the response should be, I think we just need to understand that a successful defense, regardless if we are speaking about the military context, and regardless if we are speaking about the tactical, the operational, or the strategic level, or if we are speaking about other domains, a successful defense cannot be exclusively passive. So it must include active elements or offensive elements, even, let's say, including the tactical offensive in an operational defensive scenario as an example. So just using the shield will never, let's say, be successful in the long run. It would be like a boxer who is not hitting but just protecting himself. So in the long run, he will lose, regardless how strong he would be. So for this reason, this is just I think, and it's a part of the theory of war. You just need to read Clausewitz to understand that, and he's not promoting offensive or aggressive politics. So a successful defense must include active elements. And I would call, particularly to counter different hybrid challenges or hybrid warfare challenges, what we need here is a kind of flexible response, including multiple domains and multiple dimensions, not only the political or the military field, but also including, we were speaking about sanctions, the economical field, the financial field, but also society, and also dimensions like legitimacy and morale that can be very, very strong, let's say, components in the respective struggle. So considering the whole spectrum of, let's say, horizontal escalation, but also the whole spectrum of vertical escalation. And regarding the vertical escalation spectrum, I would really argue for avoiding, let's say, an inflationary use of the term deterrence. If we are denying somebody to something that is important, and it might be a great strategy, but it doesn't function based on deterring somebody, but just about denying and changing the calculation of somebody. I'm just highlighting this because in literature we see currently a kind of huge inflation of the term deterrence. And this is, I think, dangerous because deterrence in the classical military sense, including nuclear deterrence, is as important as it was during the highest or during the hottest phases of the Cold War. So for this reason, we should not put a fog around this and letting be, let's say, downgraded. So flexible response, I think that would be my main answer to your question.
Thank you. So let me ask one last question before we go to the audience, which combines two elements that we've already discussed. We've talked largely about interference originating with significant or other nation states. What about interference that might originate from international or national criminal groups, or more importantly, extreme right-wing or left-wing groups that are very unhappy with national or subnational governments? Are these protagonists that we should worry about, or are we simply detracting from more important issues as in dealing with Russia and China? And if you could comment a little bit as well on how important is it for us to worry about other than national elections? In a number of our countries, we have provinces or states that are very important, and they have also an impact on the lives of our citizens, but also on national policies. We've had some instances in Canada suggesting that some subnational governments have been the targets of some interference. But I wonder whether, from your perspectives, one, subnational or other elections, are they important at all? And two, should we worry about extremist groups in the context, knowing that, as Johan suggested a moment ago, you do not have to be a multi-billionaire in order to pull together the wherewithal to offensively interfere in elections. Sean, can I ask you to comment on these two elements?
Yeah, I think it's a great set of questions. On the subnational elections, for my opinion, they matter very much. I'm in California. By some estimates, it's the 10th largest economy in the world. We have a discourse issue in this country. We have racial injustice being exposed as never before, and that is divided regionally and divided by key states. So we also have aspects of our infrastructure that are regional and especially our electric grid that are increasingly vulnerable. So regional elections, regional issues for cyber very much. On the issue of extremist groups, what we have seen throughout the world is Americans, for instance, and in some cases a few Canadians, turning up, and Europeans turning up in groups like ISIS and turning up in Al-Qaeda and being their propagandists. And these are people who had something happen in their life, in where they came from, that made them very disaffected. They have taken a skill base and then used it very, very effectively. The Al-Qaeda's propagandist was from California and grew up in Silicon Valley and was very, very skilled. So on the issue of extremists, within our countries, even right-wing or left-wing domestically, yes, we do have to worry about that, because those groups can attract people that have the skills. And as someone has said before, the entry is very low. The bar of entry is very low for offense. It is much easier to be disruptive. And we know that there are groups that it is a sort of a rise and return to the turn of the century in the early 1900s with the anarchist movements that we saw in Western governments. So we do have to do it. And the FBI, in our country, the FBI, when they give you a briefing on it and what they're doing to follow these groups in terms of cyber, it's very, very chilling.
Thank you, Sean. What's Estonia's perspective on this?
Well, I think certainly we have to deal also with the local elections and other state level elections in larger countries, and the extremist groups, whatever malicious influence there might be. So I cannot contest that. So.
Johan, your point of view?
Yeah, thanks for this great question. I think this is an extremely worrisome development, and I think it's the most worrisome development for quite some of our participating states. A kind of hybrid threats coming from within and deriving from non-state extremist actors, whatever spectrum they may come from, or particularly also Islamists, Salafi groups, very dangerous. And what we can see on our streets, or when, let's say, some incidents happens, terrorist attack, like we saw just a few days ago in France against a teacher. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. And this is supported, or let's say there is a much bigger field behind that. So I think we have to be very, very careful about such kind of developments, because they are approaching us at the beginning some kind of silently, not so easy to identify. And we are just identifying when something happens, but we might be not well aware of to identify, let's say, the big movements behind that. And when something happens, it's already too late, and we are just concentrating then on the incident and not on the big developments behind that. So I think this is extremely worrisome, because we can see that in some European states, but also across the Atlantic, the dividing lines within our societies are unfortunately growing and deepening. And this is an ideal starting point for hybrid actors, for influencing operations, but also for escalating the influencing operations and doing more than that. So I think maybe in the long term, this might be the most worrisome development at all. And coming to the local election point, I think everyone who comes from a nation with a federal structure will confirm the importance of that. But I think it is particularly important also below the federal level, also on the level of states or cities, because this may lead to, let's say, the leadership of radical political groups in certain areas of a state or of a city, and for this reason, I think we should also increase our awareness on these kind of developments.
Thank you. So we have only about 10 or 15 minutes left. So I want to give you a heads up that as we close, I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to take a minute or two and summarize your thoughts or your disagreements or whatnot. But we now have a number of questions from our listeners. And if there are any others, I would invite you to send them in. The first one is, given that the West, generally speaking, is under a coordinated attack by at least two significant countries, why not invoke, for example, the provisions for collective defense contained in the NATO Charter? You know, I think there's a growing sense around the world that we're unlikely to have a nuclear war. We're very unlikely to see Russian tanks roll down the central plains of Europe. So we're left with considerable aggressivity, which goes to the root of our democracies, all of us. So if that's the case, and we really take this seriously, why not invoke the NATO Charter and really do the kind of coordination that Hallie is advocating? Johan, any thoughts?
Yes, thanks a lot for this. So, well, the point is that when we think about different kind of hybrid adversaries, the way how they act is that invoking Article 5 NATO treaty will be somehow avoided. And we also have to think about, let's say, the conflicts we are facing within, as just mentioned, within some of our participating states, and that's not the business of NATO either. And also considering, let's say, some issues some allied countries have with each other, and also this is an issue which could not be solved by this. However, I think Article 5 NATO is as relevant as it ever was. But we need to think a bit bigger horizontally and also on the vertical level. So it is not anymore that easy that we just say, well, being strong here is sufficient. Being strong here is necessary in order not to being approached on that field. But hybrid actors are very creative. So, and they're creative on exploiting other domains or other levels of escalation, subversive means. So there is actually not an easy or not the answer for all these kind of threats. So, but there is one important point that is, I think, always important, raising our awareness and understanding also of this kind of challenges, the mechanisms and the patterns and the strategies behind, because they are not visible as such. We cannot see them. To think that we can identify hybrid activities by soldiers who are wearing face masks would be a kind of naive and just leaving the corona situation out of consideration. And it is, of course, regarding conflict and particularly also regarding warfare, we need to consider, let's say, that the paradoxical logic which is normally taking place here. So the better we are prepared on one field, the more it is likely that we are challenged on another one. So flexibility, I think flexible response is and will remain important, and there is not the answer because the spectrum of malicious or hybrid activities against us is very different, and the challenges one country faces might not be the same as the challenges on this field other countries face. But of course, Article 5 remains very important.
Thank you, Johan. Sean, do you think Article 5 is worth thinking about, or do we need to get a consciously organized coalition of like-minded states to start working more systematically together? What do you think?
So I think Article 5 has a place in terms of a threshold, and I think it would help drive the formulation of cyber norms, and Article 5 being a particular threshold among those norms. But first and foremost, the alliances that don't get to an Article 5 level, the things that are happening that don't reach that threshold, that don't require that level of response, that aren't considered as we would consider a conventional attack. An attack on one is an attack on all. So I really believe that the basis of the conversation needs to be the coalition of the willing and the like-minded. Part of that framework is to say, okay, at a certain point, at what point do we consider this an attack that would be in the same parlance of a conventional attack? And I think that will help frame discussion. It's disappointing that we still aren't there on this discussion of cyber response and cyber norms. And one issue that really, when we look at NATO and having participated in NATO exercises in the military, it requires training, it requires doctrine, it requires scenarios. All those things would need to be built out. And that requires significant network and digital network of sharing. And again, I keep bringing up this word, but the digital workflow, just as our battlefield order of battle, our electronic order of battle, our classic conventional order of battle. So it is an area we have to get into. I would hate for the issue, I would be displeased if the issue of Article 5 became the single focus instead of the coalition of the willing to start, because I think we'll make more progress with that faster.
Thank you. Ambassador, you're the diplomat amongst us, and diplomats would be very, very quickly involved in either a Section 5 or in the building of a coalition of the willing. Can you comment a bit from your perspective, how we might move in this area?
I think when it comes to cyber, we already have coalition of the willing. So we have a smaller group of technologically advanced nations which already have been doing these coordinated attributions and some other activities. So I think we just need to continue those efforts. As for the Article 5 and military, well, I am less optimistic with those predictions that we never will see the real military conflict anymore in this world. I still, looking at the real facts, actually tend to think that military power, of course, it's changing, but it is still there. And when we look at the troop movements just beyond our borders here, so we cannot say that the conventional military can be completely ruled out from the European security picture. So there is certainly the military component there, but what will be the basis of the Article 5 rationale? Of course, we know that we have seen many hybrid events and hybrid activities recently. But I would encourage you to think that those hybrid activities, if there will be the conventional war, would be seen as aiding the goals in the military advance. And the hybrid activities might happen also in an isolated manner, yes, but they could be also used during the military conflict, as we saw in Ukraine or in Georgia, extensively in order to help to achieve the military goals in the conflict. So I think we have to be a bit more nuanced when we read Gerasimov doctrine and the other pieces of doctrine from Russia specifically, where they see the hybrid activities still fitting into the broader military picture from their side. So I encourage we think in the same way in order to devise a proper response from our side. So of course, on everything which is below the threshold of Article 5 and below the threshold of armed conflict, we have to also react open. And we have all this coalition of willing, like-minded deterrence initiative and some other frameworks there that we can use. But Article 5 should be there as it is.
Thank you. Let me just acknowledge one of the things you've just said. I don't know, Sean, what you think, but in Canada, at any rate, we tend to forget the current worries and concerns of the Baltic and Nordic states in particular about the threat of Russia from a military perspective. The Atlantic is a very, very large lake, and we tend to forget that a little bit. But I know that in talking to people from that part of the world, and indeed other parts of NATO and of the Union, they're not quite as sanguine as I think we are in North America, that none of this will ever happen again. So I take your point. I think it's a very, very valid one. And it goes, in fact, back to one of the points I was making at the very beginning, is that context for all of this is very important. And we cannot just think of cyber in isolation of other diplomatic, military, and whatnot, other considerations. Let me ask you one last question and then ask you to comment more generally on anything that you'd like to. If you were, as my children used to say, either king or queen of the castle, and that you had the capacity to command one specific step to move forward on this issue of our ability to deal with foreign interference, what would that step be? You know, assume that you have all powers and that, you know, it can't be move us all to Mars, but, you know, what would you suggest as the one most important step we could take in order to advance our ability to deal with this, I think, growing problem? Johan, can we start with you?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. And my answer would be the education of judgment, the comprehensive education of judgment of our political, our military, of our societal leaders, decision makers, conceptual planners, academics, because there will not be the answer for all these kind of threats, but we need leaders, decision makers, advisors with an educated judgment regarding hybrid threats, hybrid challenges, hybrid warfare challenges, including all possible domains, the civil as well as the military components, to being able to provide, let's say, comprehensive answers. Because in the end, what is necessary is not a political, it's not a diplomatic, it's not a military only answer, but a comprehensive one. So that would be my single first step if I would be the queen of or the king of this endeavor. And let me just add one additional point, because Haley made this good point. When I speak about hybrid warfare, I always include the military and the conventional, even the nuclear domain. I know that there is sometimes a misperception about what hybrid warfare is about, and in some conceptions, this excludes the military. But that would be, out of my perspective, a wrong understanding, because if we would say hybrid warfare is just something below the threshold of the use of force, we could not even use this conception to explain the Ukraine case. So, and the main challenge actually in the context of this kind of warfare is the combination of symmetric as asymmetric, military and non-military. And having, let's say, the military in the background, also that includes the military, the nuclear domain, even if it is not actively used or just used as a kind of show of force operation, this is a massive force multiplier for any kind of subversive activities. And for this reason, that needs to be taken into consideration. So hybrid warfare is war, potentially including all levels of escalation.
Thank you, Johan. That's a very, very useful reminder. And I admit that that's a path I sometimes go down. And your reminder will give me pause the next time I think of hybrid. Sean, you're the king of the castle. What's the one step you would recommend?
That we, I would say that there has to be an upgrade to an infrastructure that allows us to share at speed and exchange information. First, there's the willingness. So let's say the willingness to share is there. There has to be this infrastructure that allows us. It cannot be what we have today, which is we have the lack of an ability to communicate rapidly and effectively in a way that analysts across boundaries can use the information. We can too easily use that as an excuse, and I say we, the United States, we can too easily use that as an excuse not to support and be part of a larger coalition digitally very quickly. Now, there has been progress. Again, we had great leadership at Cyber Command deploying to Montenegro. I have been to Moldova. I understand what's going on in Transnistria. I've been to the bridge and seen the Russian tanks on the other side, but I don't think most Americans have that perspective. And so the connectivity needs to be there. It can't be trying to talk across channels that are not compatible. And it cannot be that everything is locked away in a safe at a level of quote secrecy, because that secret has a half-life of days, minutes. And so there's an attitude part that I would, if I had the wand, the magic wand. And the second is something that we can achieve very, very quickly in a secure, in a public secure cloud environment, the ability to share quickly.
Thank you. Heli, what would you suggest?
I would suggest something what Johan also mentioned, which is education and raising resilience. I think the more immune our societies are and our structures are, the less success is there for all sorts of interference activities. So, for instance, interestingly, in the Baltic states, all these information or disinformation campaigns have not been successful because we still remember to read between the lines and not to take everything face value. And I think I would suggest, yes, I know it's difficult in a broader context, but educating the public and educating opinion leaders about possibility of disinformation, fake news, and interference. I think that's the best what we can do. Plus all these countermeasures and all this collective action that we have been talking for 1 hour and a half now.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to ask each of you if you have any last thoughts on either something that we've talked about or something that we did not talk about and should have. And then Yuri, I will pass it back to you. So Sean, any last minute thoughts more generally?
No, I think that my colleagues have made outstanding points, and I'm so glad to be on a panel with folks who bring a perspective that's not North America and a perspective that is honed by real experience and that sense of urgency.
Thank you. Johan?
Yeah, thank you very much for being part of this excellent panel and for sharing thoughts with you and the audience. Maybe my last point, which I would highlight, is to say, well, when it comes to hybrid threats, hybrid conflict, hybrid warfare challenges, everything started with a deficit in understanding the pattern, the strategies behind. And for this reason, what I mentioned, improving our comprehensive understanding, respective education of judgment, and doing this based on a kind of analytical framework. And this is actually what we are also working on, to have a kind of analytical framework which could be used as a kind of tool for improving these kind of education of judgment, and to being able to, let's say, to see the invisible and to connect the invisible dots behind hybrid adversaries strategies. But thank you very much for this excellent event and for the possibility for me to take part here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Heli, last word to you.
Thank you for this interesting panel and all the questions which were intriguing enough. And yeah, I would just maybe repeat what I have already said, that resilience, education, and collective action would be very helpful in our case.
Thank you. So let me say thank you to you. I think this has been a very interesting panel. I've learned a few things that I didn't know, and I think that's one of the objectives of panels like this, is to share information. I very much think that the initiative of the CDAI and the Union Embassy in Ottawa is something worth pursuing. The perspective of North America and the perspective of Europe is very different on a number of issues. And to the extent that we can promote dialogue, discussion, disagreement even, so that we can come to a greater understanding of the various issues that affect us, be it on cyber or anything else. So I hope our two sponsoring organizations will do more of this. So again, thank you very much, my dear colleagues. And Yuri, back to you.
All right, thank you very much, Dick. This was a really interesting conversation. Thank you, Heli. Thank you, Sean. And thank you, Johan. And yes, there actually will be another event very soon in cooperation with the EU in 2 weeks from now, which will be talking about the situation in Mali from a transatlantic perspective. Now, When we shut down this event today, we will be putting the entire recording of this available online. So we just have to toggle the playback mode. We will shoot an email off to everyone who's attending and who was registered. So you'll be able to view it again and maybe share with some of your colleagues if you thought this was useful and interesting, as I did. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and see you.